Hi, team, and welcome back to the Learning Future podcast and this wonderful series that we're doing on education transformed. Today, we have an exciting conversation with two wonderful change makers in the education space. Aliyah Irabor is the founder of Pupil Power, a nationwide movement in the United Kingdom, which empowers young people to develop their agency to reimagine the 21st century's education system. She started this organization at age 16. She's clearly an incredible young person. She's also an associate consultant at Big Change and was the youngest board member for Lifter Education. Currently studying at the University of Cambridge, no less. It's wonderful to have you here, Aliyah. And joining her is Eloïse Haylor, this wonderful human being that I've been able to connect with through Salzburg Global Seminar. And in her work with the charity Big Change, she really tries to nurture global alliances, in particular, the big education conversation, which has evolved from a singular campaign in England to now become this global movement that was launched at the UN Transforming Education Summit in New York last year. I was very lucky to connect with the team at that time as well. Welcome to both of you. It's wonderful to have you.
Thanks for having us. It's Luca.
And I note that you're both there in Salzburg Global Seminar, doing some really profound learning. And of course, Eloïse, this is where you and I met for the first time, and kind of some of the work around transforming education, which is the name of this series, in partnership with Salzburg Global. So question one, what's something that you're learning at the moment that's really sitting with you as you consider the ways that you both contribute and learn, in your case, Aliyah, as well as a younger person?
I'll go first. The first thing I've learned is that actually learning takes place in different settings. It doesn't just take place in a school building or a school institution. I'm at second year university at Cambridge, and so it's often people assume that that's where all my sort of knowledge building takes place. When actually, when actually I'm in Salzburg. It's term time right now, so if anyone from Cambridge University that teaches me is listening or watching, please just act like you don't know who I am, because actually they wouldn't be.
Did you get a leave pass?
Things like this.
Right.
When actually my brain, the energy, at the end of the day, I'm just down here because I've had to use my brain and think in ways that I just don't on a daily basis at university, which goes to show that when you're around different people, when you're removed from your everyday life in another country, when you're in an environment that looks completely different to what you're used to, when you are just in conversation, just dialogue in itself, you can just learn so much. And it's interesting how a place like Cambridge doesn't actually support that, or at least advocate for that way of learning. They have a very traditional way of learning, which is useful for sure. But I definitely have learned that learning can take place in different shapes and forms, and it can be more abstract and weird. We've just been taking walks around the lake, and the things that come out of that are so much more rich than me sitting in the library trying to cram information from a book.
For an exam. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Aliyah. Gosh, this is a great start. I mean, the difference between schooling and learning, and we think schooling is learning when really learning is everything in life. And then how is that being recognized and applied? So good. Eloïse, what would you add to that beautiful articulation?
Oh, so much. I think especially being here in Salzburg with so many different people with different perspectives, speaking different languages. Something I'm really learning is the power of listening and trying to understand that and deepen that. You'll never really learn that. That's, going to be a continual learning process. Thank you for the question. I think it's such a brilliant question. I sort of asked myself, what would it be like if I started every day or every meeting with my line report with that, rather than jumping into to-dos and action. And I think one of the things that's come up here is what does it really mean to listen? It's to who and to what. So it's not just the verbal. That can sometimes be a game, and certain people dominate in that. But what does it mean to listen to the non-verbal, to the precognitive even? What does it mean to really attune to each other in the process of co-creation? And also the non-human, the bird song here is phenomenal. It's rich. But I'm really aware that our culture privileges, and there are other cultures represented here that don't. So I think that's what I'm keen on.
I love that. Gosh, so many places to click. Let's click on I think let's click on listening. I reckon that's because when we think about transforming education systems and the work that Big Change has really been leading and articulating as well as part of this group, it's been convened in Salzburg. It does, those 3 Ps of purpose, power, and practice. And certainly power, the idea of having, a young person alongside you, Eloïse, Alicia, and, in that, Aliyah, in that space. Oh, and a nice hug. It really is something about the power of agency of co-design, of really listening and saying, hey, what's your experience? What are your dreams for the future? And then, to be honest, sometimes us as adults just shutting up a little bit and letting young people speak.
Yeah, but active listening, right? Because I think often we can, if you just say everybody needs to listen more, then everyone can do that. But I think there's a differentiation between those that listen to listen and those that listen to learn. And so I believe the relationship that I have with Big Change, or the relationship that I have with Eloïse, for instance, is around active listening. Whereas in contrast, I've been in spaces with people where I just know they're listening because they just want me to say what I need to say, but they've already got the assumptions made in their head, and they've already potentially got actions that they're going to do. What I'm saying isn't actually influencing them in any way. So I guess listening with no assumptions, listening with no expectations, being open-minded, and allowing yourself to be willing to change and moved and shaped.
Allowing yourself to be moved, a movement, something I think on. I mean, if I can continue, I think it really links to the big education conversation, right? Which is an initiative that began with Big Change as a campaign in England, has now kind of grown to a global invitation. That's really an invitation to create a space where different people can ask and discuss what they believe is the purpose of education. So what is education really for? And for me, something that Andreas Schleicher says a lot, which is in his experience, a lot of the barriers to change are not in the things that you see on the surface, but they're actually the assumptions and the beliefs, really the fears that are below the surface. And we just don't have enough spaces in society where you can hold that conversation and surface those.
And that's where intergenerational, this term of intergenerational collaboration comes in, and why it's so magical and special, because I've facilitated and hosted and been a part of loads of big education conversations, and it's always with people that are not in the same group as me. And so I represent a young person, I'm a student, having conversations with other students is great. But what happens when I'm having conversations with my teachers or my lecturers or even parents? It's just the sort of bridging between the two worlds, because we're all in our own bubble, in our own worlds. What happens when you bridge together is just really magical, I would say. Yeah.
I really love this idea. I think, Aliyah, you were speaking to it, that, active listening. I reflect on the power of generative listening, that the kind of, how do you just create a container in which something can emerge from it? And everyone's like, oh, wow, we didn't even notice that would come. The power of dialogue and conversation, I think. And I feel like many of us, because of perhaps the pace of the world, the pace of schools and education systems, everyone is moving so quickly, and sometimes feels like there's not time to kind of sit down, listen to the bird song, Eloïse, and actually just get a real sense of where are we in the world? Where are we in kind of the arc of this lesson, this unit, this school, this nation, this kind of species, I reflect quite a lot in our work on, the disruptive technologies that are bearing down on us right now, particularly generative AI. And, the things that are most human, like listening. I wonder how you would, Ali, imagine going into a conversation being, holding open the question, I'm prepared to be changed by this conversation. Isn't that an interesting reflection? You know what I mean? As opposed to, I've got some things to tell you, Aliyah. Sit down and let me teach you a couple of things. I mean, how do you see kind of the experience changing, or what young people are asking for, Aliyah, from yourself directly, and also Eloïse, from what you're noticing in kind of the big change conversations across the globe?
Do you mind like rephrasing that question for me a little bit? Because I've got so much in my head that I want to like really make
Totally.
sure
Well, I'm keeping it pretty open deliberately, to be honest with you. But I guess here's the way I would put it. You know, when we talk about education transformation, and we talk about it all the time on this podcast, at least, you know, it's a preferred future state. How do you imagine that future state for education? Like the role of young people, the role of the educator or the teacher, you know, in schools and university, what needs to shift, do you think, to get us to that state?
Well, I think it's a perfect question in regards to like where we are right now and what we're doing. So this whole conference in itself is around reflecting on the idea of intergenerational collaboration and intergenerational leaders in different spaces, because there's different organizations here and people represent different groups. For me, what I've learned, interestingly enough, so for like my vision of education and the vision of transforming education has always been around like making education more democratic, thinking about who is involved in the decision making and how we can, at least we know it right now in the UK context, that we have a hierarchy and students and parents kind of fall at the bottom of that hierarchy of decision making and power. Yeah. And so coming to this conference, I had ideas around already what it meant of who holds the power and who are the gatekeepers, right? And what I've learned is that actually it's not about shifting power. We talk about it as if it's really like finite and limited. And perhaps it's more about sharing power, because at least from my experience, when I've challenged the adults around me to let young people's voices be heard and have a space as well on the table, when that happens, it always still doesn't feel like enough, because actually passing a microphone to a young person isn't going to allow them to create any change. Having me on a panel representing young people isn't going to spark any change, at least immediately. And so I think just even the language around shifting power, is it really shifting power? Adults can maybe be fearful of that potentially because they don't want to give up their own power that they hold. So like kind of changing the language to like, what does it mean to share power is something that I've been reflecting on a little bit more. And so my vision for education is around changing mindsets and like kind of shifting people's internal way of being and their behavior to be more comfortable around sharing spaces. And yeah, like sharing rather than like giving up, because I've realized that people don't want to just give up. And maybe that is like a long-term future vision. But then I think if the world was all just run by young people, then that's even then still not intergenerational, right?
No,
it's doing the complete opposite. So it is around like sharing the space together and making sure that it reflects. There's an opportunity for everyone to feel comfortable. Like the culture has to really be co-designed by everybody. Like it isn't enough for adults to just say, okay, we're going to let young people into the space, because that's still on their conditions. So it needs to be like sort of co-designed, co-created,
co-owned, co-authored. I love it.
Yeah.
Beautifully put.
But yeah.
I like it. Eloïse, what would you add?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you just said like adults letting young people into the space. I think something that's come up here, and especially from some of the young people here, is that adults need to be really clear on why they need young people to be shaping education, what they want to learn from young people. So I think for me, a vision of a future education system is one where everybody is learning, and that's really celebrated. Because I think teachers and adults role modeling the vulnerability that comes with learning really breaks down some of the boundaries that I think create a lot of fear and a feeling of inability to express who you really are. That's one of the things that really comes out of the big education conversations, is young people just want to be heard and seen and able to express the kind of multiplicitous things that they are and that's shape-shifting all the time. And it's just so bizarre that we've created a system where you have to fit into a box. Like, why would we want that when we have multiple crises coming this century, and we're going to need so many different skills and so many different people coming together in teams and understanding how to work together and appreciate each other's different skills. So that would be a kind of vision. And I think, Big Change talk about transformation as being a shift in the goals of the system. So really fundamental, and as opposed to reform, which is, it also important, but it's incremental improvements on the current system that you have, but leaving the ultimate goals in place. And I would love a system where we're all contributing to those goals and even acknowledging that they might need to change over the course of this century. We have a system that's flexible and is change ready. Yeah,
that's so brilliant. One of my favorite quotes is, I think, from a fellow countryman of both of you, which is Dylan Willem. And he says, schools are places young people go to watch adults work very hard. And it's sometimes like, I think, because the point here is that we all need each other. Like, if we've learned anything about systems, it's that we're all in this together. And like, I think your points, Aliyah, on not kind of shifting power, but sharing it. And I wonder even if it's possible to cultivate it. Like, can we grow power actually in a community through elevating? Yeah, it's not just letting young people run the show, because that's swinging the pendulum too far. It's actually the co-agency that comes from young people initiated, but held and structured with the professionals around young people, so that we can kind of seek fulfillment. I think your point around new education goals is so spot on, Eloïse. I kind of think the efficiency paradigm, and in some ways the improvement paradigm or reform paradigm, is part of the problem. It's a transformation paradigm. Now, we still need, and Dr. Karen Edge, who I think it might be even with you, she spoke about this on this podcast, we still need incremental change, but it's in what direction? So it's not that we're going to kind of blow everything up and say, okay, now it's a free for all. No, there's still going to be incremental change, but the kind of destination ought to be different, I think.
And the intention, I would say, like, I don't know, what worries me or panics me about incremental change is that there's no sense of like urgency.
Yes.
And so I think that's what, like, again, for me, I know that the change isn't going to happen overnight, but there needs to be a level of urgency, because the impact and the sort of like repercussions of not doing it, the consequences are like life-threatening, quite literally.
Yeah.
And the same way we talk about like the climate crisis with so much urgency and like just not, as I want to say create fear, but that people really see the impact it's having. I don't think people see the same impact on education.
Yeah.
Which is why the big education conversation in itself exists as well, to get everyone involved in the conversation, to make education everybody's business. Just because you're not in school doesn't mean you can't contribute to transforming education. And doesn't mean it's not relevant to you, because learning is lifelong, but yet the school system doesn't share that idea, because school, at least of how it's portrayed right now, is about passing exams and getting good results. And so, yeah, I think there needs to be more urgency around it. And that's why I'm really intentional about thinking bigger and boldly and more radically, which can scare people, about our intentions for transforming education, but not just reforming it. Yeah.
I love it. My reflection often, Aliyah, on that is the danger is very rarely we're too bold. It's always the opposite. Yeah. It's we're not bold enough. We're not big enough. We're not dreaming enough. We're thinking, we'll just tweak the thing on the cut. No, it's like, we do need a transformation. We need kind of, in some ways, really significant big shifts.
But how can you imagine that if you don't see it? And that's what I think a lot of what's coming out is around people, even when we're like co-designing frameworks and stuff, everyone's just reverting to the way that they know to do it. So we're all here with the intentions to just like think of something so like transformative. But the first thing we go to is writing a policy brief or policy recommendation. And we've had to snap out of it. Like, guys, we don't need to write a literature review. We can do something in a really cool and funky abstract way. And that also can be acceptable. So it's interesting how like play is often seen as, we were speaking about this earlier, like adults particularly are like, they're so far away from the days where they were playing using crayons. Like, we've been doing drawing activities and people might listen to that and say like, what are you really doing? Like, is this just a fun retreat? But it's like, when we're talking about really important things and coming up with really great solutions, but doing them in really different ways. So like, drawing pictures, drawing what that future looks like. And it's hard to do because you have to, I guess, transform yourself first.
Yes.
and I guess something I said earlier, and I'll stop talking afterwards, is around like, it's harder to, I guess I have so much urgency because I can see inside more clearly what the issues are. And I'm scared that the older I get and the further away, the proximity away from the actual system, the more I'm not going to actually understand it. And that's, I think, why there's so much urgency. It's like, the further you are away, like our politicians now, like that are really just old and just, it's just, they don't actually understand the problems of today, are still trying to transform things that they experience. And so, they're so detached and so unaware of what the real problems are.
Yeah. I mean, you've made me think of something that one of the conversations we've had is who might be the barriers to transformation. It's quite a hard question to ask. We prefer to think of what.
Yes.
Who feels quite personal and physical. And one of the things that came up was people who lack imagination. Yeah.
Oh.
And I said, I think it's people who don't feel safe to imagine.
Beautiful reframe.
Actually, I think that's the part of the problem. And what we've tried to do with the big education conversation is create just enough structure that you feel safe within these boundaries to reimagine.
Yeah.
And also to think about the space in which you have that. So, in a school, if you're having that conversation there are already pre-existing power dynamics inherent in the place, right? But if you have that conversation outside, or you have it in a cafe, or you
feel
have
so much safer.
Yeah.
Different conversations happen and you unlock imagination, which is what's needed to kind of achieve this radical transformation that we're talking about.
COVID was a perfect example. Like, I was having a conversation yesterday with another young person, Jarina, amazing. And we were literally just discussing, like, there were so many youth organizations and youth movements that were born out of COVID. What's interesting about that, we wasn't in school, right? We almost had permission to be creative, to think bigger. But when you're in school, and again, now that COVID is sort of like slowed down and everyone's back into school, the momentum is just slowed down.
Yes.
Because again, you're just like now back in the system and you've got all these constraints around you, and it kind of limits your freedom to think in these ways that is required to transform the system.
Yeah. I think this piece on an urgency, right? It's so good, because I feel like if we really slow down and think about it, the system that is a legacy system that we've inherited largely and now globally, right? But, initially kind of a colonial Western paradigm, it fails tens of millions of human beings every single day. It fails young people, children, and adults. Because I feel like there's something about the standardization of you as a productive unit, as opposed to you as a kind of irreducibly unique human being that has all these different gifts and skills. And that's the system conversation. And then, of course, you see the kind of all the flowers blooming of people that are transforming kind of at their local level. And I think, to your point, Aliyah, that's what can happen when people organize. A small group of committed citizens can change the world. Thank you, Margaret Mead. She's right. It's like the catch cry of Salzburg Global Seminar. Like, it's so true when we come together and we discuss the real questions at the heart of things. And then, of course, we need to go away and do the inner work on that, because who are we being in allowing the sparks to fall away around us? Like that. Who am I being, and am I transforming myself as I try to transform the system? Because the answer to that is no. Well, then I'm not listening. And I can't listen, actually, because it's about, I'm caught in a loop in some way. Oh gosh, wonderful conversation. I could keep going. I've got two final questions for you. All right, one is, let's say we're sitting down in, let's say 10 years time, because I usually say 20, but things are moving so quickly now. Let's say it's 2033. What kind of hope or dream or imagination, considering we've brought that up, what kind of future do you imagine, Eloïse? And what kind of future do you imagine, Aliyah, for young people, for the human beings supporting them, the adults? What do you think?
It feels like a long time away, but I know it will just we'll flick our fingers and it will be here. I guess being in Salzburg for the seminar, I've really learned that there's a lot of like internal work and development that we need to do within ourselves before we can even imagine groups of people doing it, communities doing it, a whole society to do it.
Yeah.
And so I hope that in the next 10 years, even by 2030, we are comfortable with having these conversations. It's no longer something that's seen as radical, something that's seen as ambitious. I hope that everyone's on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
And we're no longer spending our time trying to convince people why this work is important. And now we've built like a great network of allies. So there's just getting rid of the resistance, I would say, to do this work so we can just get on with it. That's, I think, the biggest challenge is just the resistance and having to constantly convince people and challenge people to imagine this sort of stuff.
It's so good. I think it's the resistance. Convince people, and in some ways convince ourselves.
Yeah.
It's like overcoming our own resistance to having to step into the uncertainty, the change, and the imagination space can be deeply scary as well as exciting.
I have to convince myself sometimes, which is ironic because I'm like leading this work, but like sometimes I go back and I feel like by speaking to people that can't imagine, I internalize some of it sometimes.
Yeah.
And I have to go back and remind myself of my why, my purpose of why I'm doing this, why it's important, and sort of refresh. Sort of refresh the tab and not absorb everybody else's doubt.
Yeah.
Sometimes I just think, am I being too ambitious? Is this even possible? Like, I can't see the impact of what I'm doing. And actually, no, it's the steps. It's a journey.
Which is why communities like this make a difference, because everyone goes through that. And so you need the cheerleaders to be like with you and reflect back to you what you know but have forgotten, or but feel like you can't listen to in that moment because you've absorbed those other inputs.
Having examples of everyday acts of transformation, which is an initiative that we're both working on, which will essentially just like showcase and exemplify all the work in areas and pockets of the world that we just don't see. Real people, young people, just doing things that seem small but are contributing to the bigger picture.
I love it.
Yeah.
To the bigger picture.
Yeah, transformation, big words, small steps was
like
a lot of small moments that make up something.
It's beautiful. It's so beautiful because that's kind of what any learning community is, right? It's like it's big goals but small steps. Even the act of learning itself, being in the kind of pit, in the mess of like, I don't really understand, and then coming to some point of growth or development or expansion. I mean, it's the thing that excites me the most about any work in education is kind of the possibility that we can expand in ever greater ways and kind of discover more and more about what might be ours to do, in the world, to contribute to, particularly at a community level. It's such a wonderful, wonderful initiative. I look forward to following that one as well. Final question to you both. What's your take? Oh, all right, Eloïse. Actually, yeah, sure.
Sorry.
Give us actually the truth. How would you frame this?
Well, I'll try and be quick for you. Well, I guess building on what you said, I think it would be a world where we can talk about the fear and the resistance we feel rather than numbing it in all of these processes or intellectualizing it or coming up with other excuses for why something's not happening, when really it's just, I feel scared.
Yeah.
And then counter to that, where there's real respect for joy as a fuel.
Well, yeah.
I mean,
silence.
Oh, it's so profound. I'm like, silence. I'm like, damn, that was great. Real respect for joy as a fuel. I mean, it really seems to me like what we're talking about here is fulfillment. We're not talking really even about like traditional success. It's really a life worthy of being lived. An education worth having. A conversation worth engaging in. I mean, what really matters most? I mean, that's a really kind of philosophical question, but I think it's really at the heart of this work, isn't it? It's like, are we wasting our time if we're not really involving every single agent as an agent of change? Speaking of, as agents of change, two of them leading, the big education conversation and all a whole bunch of other work, it looks like, in the works. What would you leave us with, both of you?
Do you want to go first? I think I need for once to think.
Take home message for us.
So I come from, my role in big change. We see ourselves as a catalyst, and so we really try and think about being low ego and staying small and working out what our role is in connecting others, bring them together, like enabling things to happen. And someone here had a really great phrase that was, what's the mountain that you're trying to climb? What would it be like to bring people together around that question? Obviously, we are here in this alpine location, so there's multiple layers to it, but I think it's, for me, an interesting question. What's it like to bring people around shared challenges rather than trying to seek agreements around everything? Because that's never going to be possible, and that's not how you move forward. So it's actually through just the doing of the collaboration and the bringing into reality the future that you're imagining, that you enable other people to feel bold enough to follow suit.
Love it. Aliyah?
My takeaway message. So this is like what I want, like the note I want to leave.
What are you going to leave people with? It's the, resonating with them, our listeners.
I would just say, just reflecting back on like yourself, thinking about what role you want to consciously play, and going through a sort of like reflection process, like an internal reflection process, and understanding like ways. So I'd say, just reflecting on yourself and ways in which you can just be a better human being. And I think in turn, it will just humanize the whole process.
Yeah.
I think we're missing that a lot. Like we've been speaking a lot this week about like jargonizing, de-jargonizing like the language that we use, and using these big words and terms that just doesn't land with normal everyday people whose work this is. And so, I guess the note I want to like leave everybody on is like just to think about like what role do you want to play. This is, like I said, an urgent call for action, and so we need everybody. I ask, join this movement, join this journey, and think about what role you're going to play in it, in whatever capacity. Right? There's roles for everybody in whatever capacity.
That's a beautiful question, Aliyah. Thank you. What role do you want to play? What might be yours to do as part of being a better human? The real talk. Eloïse, Aliyah, thank you so much for jumping in for this podcast conversation during your time there at Salzburg Global Seminar. It's been a real delight to hear your views about the bigeducationconversation.org, which is the website I think people can go to find out more and see where these conversations are happening and hosting one of them themselves. But thank you to both of you for the roles that you play, as well as joining us for this conversation.
Thanks so much for having us, Luca.
It's been a delight. Great.